Hey everybody, thank you for joining me. In this video I want to talk a little bit about the nature of economics. Now of course the nature of economics is quite an ambitious topic and maybe cannot be discussed directly in any video. So the way I want to approach this is I want to talk about the theory of marginal utility. Now why would you be interested in the nature of economics? I think if you're interested in economics, you're automatically interested in the nature of economics. However, another reason is perhaps that, the economy, in fact, the world economy doesn't seem to be doing super well, seemingly at least for the past 20 years, but recently also we have higher levels of inflation, and therefore it only stands to reason that economics doesn't have a great reputation in public opinion. If airplanes would fall out of the sky every day, then maybe physics would also not have the best reputation. But this is not the case in regards to airplanes, but economies regularly seem to crash, and therefore economics, doesn't have the best reputation. It wouldn't make sense, however, to talk about what scientificness ought to be or what economics is in a purely abstract way. I do believe that we can only have a meaningful discussion about economics by talking about specific economic theory. The theory I chose for this is, you read it already here, is the theory of marginal utility. I think this theory lends itself for the overarching topic of the video because it is one of the most fundamental theories we come across when learning economics. So we're going to press the question basically why this theory means what it means, and hopefully we can have a discussion about economics in general by talking about this theory in this way. Little disclaimer up front, this is not the perfect video for anybody who has to write a test or an exam tomorrow and needs to watch some stuff about marginal utility or utility functions and curves and stuff like that. Here we're going to focus on the meaning of the theory. Let's begin with the definition. The theory of diminishing marginal utility, or of course as it's also called the law of diminishing marginal utility, goes as follows. The additional utility derived from the consumption of the next unit of a given good diminishes as the quantity of that good increases. Now, of course, this theory refers to marginal utility, but we'll do ourselves a favor when we begin with defining what actually just utility is. So let's do that. Utility is defined in economics as something purely subjective. Utility is just defined as our subjective well-being. Or our level of satisfaction. I'm not going to write that there as well, but utility is our subjective well-being or our level of satisfaction. And the theory says or claims that we do get or experience additional utility, that means our subjective well-being does increase with another unit of a given good. But it makes a specific qualification on how our utility increases. It says that the additional utility derived from the consumption of the next unit of a given good diminishes as the quantity of that good increases. Now, something is diminishing, and that doesn't sound like an increase. But what's diminishing here is the increase in self. So the more of a given good we consume, yes, the higher will be our subjective well-being or our utility. However, our utility increases merely in progressively smaller and smaller and smaller steps. However, it is an increase the more units of that good we consume. This is underlined by the term diminishing. Diminishing indicates that whatever it is that gets smaller, something of it remains left. So we always have an increase in utility, or we always have additional utility. However, our additional utility just becomes smaller. The increase in utility becomes smaller the more units of that good we consume. Here we have 3 burgers. And so according to the theory, we'll derive the most additional utility from the first burger, and we'll derive less additional utility from a second burger, and even less additional utility from a third burger. And in that framework of 3 burgers, personally, I would not be able to eat more than 1. But for the sake of argument, we're going to stick with 3 burgers or 3 pizza slices. It does make sense that we do experience an increase in our utility. However, it increases in progressively smaller steps, given that the more we already ate, well, the less hungry, of course, we get. However, there are 2 objections that can be raised against such an example. The first objection is the notion that the 10th burger increases our subjective well-being by a small increment is ridiculous. Ridiculous may be a little bit harsh, but it's just difficult to maintain. However, the theory claims that we do experience an increase in utility, but that our increase merely becomes smaller and smaller the more units of that good we consume. So that's one problem. And sometimes the reply that you'll hear is, well, then we have actually negative marginal utility, which of course equates to a net decrease in our utility or our subjective well-being overall. Now, conceptually, that's of course no problem for anybody to conceive. However, it simply doesn't comply with what the theory claims to be the case. And it's not just a theory. The theory claims itself to be a law. And even if you admit that then you have negative marginal utility and a decrease in utility overall, then you have a law that's only true unless it isn't. But I cannot imagine any good for which an actual decline of overall well-being wouldn't be the result if you have a sufficiently high number of units of that good available for consumption. So that's an objection that hopefully we can address in the course of this video. First, before we move on, I want to draw some attention also to the second objection which we have down here. And that would be, well, what makes the theory particularly economical, and does it stand on its own feet? So what I mean by this is, even if we focus on the part of the example, we're gonna not focus on 10 burgers where we would have a negative marginal utility. We're gonna assume that everybody can consume 3 burgers and that the theory totally applies here. So we have less additional utility with continuous consumption. So the fact that we cannot eat infinite amounts of burgers is obviously has to do with our digestive system. So the additional utility actually diminishes with continuous consumption because we cannot fit infinite amounts of burgers in our stomachs. So this has to do with our physiology, and this is described by a different science altogether, which is perfectly established and has a great reputation too, and rightly so. And that would be, I imagine, biology in this case. And so the question that lingers in the air with such an example is, well, if in order to explain why the theory of marginal utility applies, we actually rely on information that is the subject matter of a different science, then the question becomes, well, what makes this theory, our economic theory of marginal utility, what makes it an economic theory? And does it stand on its own feet? And this question really touches the overarching topic of the video, which is the nature of economics. Does economics have its own essence? And if not, wouldn't people be better off to, rather than economics in this case, just study biology in order to understand human behavior? So that's the second objection that can be brought up when such an example is given for the theory. Before we move on, I just quickly want to point out also that these 2 objections are really not alleviated if we bring the theory into a mathematical expression. Here we have our utility function with a utility curve. Here, of course, we have marginal utility function, which is the first derivative of a utility function. And yeah, if we move to the right in the coordinate system, we also move upwards, but the curve becomes continuously shallower, which corresponds to what the theory claims to be the case, meaning that our additional utility continuously gets smaller and smaller the more units of that good we consume. So here we have a mathematical expression that complies with what the theory says, but it doesn't contribute anything to our understanding of why the theory means what it means. Or in other words, from a purely mathematical perspective, we can also draw this, and this obviously you can do with mathematics, and you can also draw an exponentially growing graph, but they don't comply with the theory. And so bringing the theory into a mathematical expression doesn't necessarily prove or help our understanding of the theory. The first thing in bringing some light into the discussion is by reminding ourselves that the theory doesn't actually refer to burgers as such. So if we look into the definition of the theory, what the theory refers to is, it refers to goods. Now obviously you and I probably believe that burgers are goods, and of course in the real world burgers are goods. However, the question is, what makes a good a good? Or in other words, what differentiates something which is a good from another thing which is not a good? Because not everything in the world that we can, objectively detect and identify is actually a good. So that's the follow-up question that we need to focus on right now. And this is not a question that we are bringing up here originally. So a little historical excursion. Here we have the three founders of the theory of marginal utility, each of whom worked independently of one another and espoused their theory in 1871. And of the three guys, Carl Menger here sticks out because he went one step further than the other two dudes by deriving the theory of marginal utility itself as a result of investigating its assumptions. So all three espoused the theory and they used it to build further theory on it. But Menger derives the theory itself as a result of investigating its assumptions. When you pick up his book, Principles of Economics, then you're going to see that his work begins with an investigation into the goods character of goods. And according to Menger, there are a couple of factors that decide whether or not a thing can be considered a good or not. But he introduces a subjective element into this definition. So Menger points out that goods are subjectively conditioned. To be fair, he also points out that objective characteristics play a role as well. But for the time being, let's focus on this peculiar subjective condition that conditions goods. How exactly is it meant? Well, he points out that we can only meaningfully talk about goods in the context of concrete human actions that utilize something for the attainment of an end or for the satisfaction of an underlying need. And this is in fact how goods are defined from a purely subjective perspective. So goods are defined by later Austrian economists simply as means for the attainment of an end. Means and ends, of course, are categories of action. And action, of course, is conscious behavior and always aims at improvement. Not philosophically or in some absolute sense, in some moral sense or in some sense of perfectionism, but to the extent that any action can be considered an action at all, it always aims at the satisfaction of an underlying dissatisfaction or of an underlying need. And what this means is, well, to the extent that goods are subjectively conditioned, that means that goods owe their character as a good to the fact that they are ascribed the ability to satisfy an underlying need, the theory of marginal utility applies. Why? Because if we had 2 units of that good rather than less units of that good, or rather than 1 unit of that good, then the second unit of that good corresponds with a less urgent underlying need due to the fact that we already have one unit of that good available, and due to the fact that the good as such is subjectively conditioned in that the acting individual ascribes to it the ability to satisfy the underlying need. What does this mean for the theory of marginal utility? Well, this means the theory is not actually to be understood as successive consumption of one and the same thing. The theory is more correctly understood as under the condition under which any given thing assumes the character of being a good in the first place, namely by being utilized by an acting individual for the satisfaction of an underlying end, or need, If under that very condition the acting individual had more units of that good rather than less units of that good, then the additional utility diminishes as the quantity of that good increases. This, of course, is a purely subjectivist perspective or explanation of the theory of marginal utility. But it is unique, so it's very unique to economics. Now, I do understand if people are skeptical and saying, well, the fact that I simply get full, my stomach gets full after another burger, is a much more plausible and intuitive explanation as to why the theory of marginal utility would apply in the burger example. And honestly, I completely agree with this. So in the burger example, I would much rather rely on simple biology in order to explain why the additional utility diminishes in a given framework. However, the subjectivist explanation of the theory of marginal utility also has strong merit, or marginalism, or this marginal analysis also has strong merits, because we have plenty of empirical analysis which demonstrates that, for example, means of production are priced according to their marginal productivity, as is true with labor. So actually I think this is a good point to end this video, and basically have to have the discussion continue in the comment section. What do you think of the subjectivist explanation of the theory of marginal utility? Is it new to you? Did I do a bad or okay job at it? So, okay, at this point, thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your comments in the comment section, and talk to you soon. Bye-bye.